It's an important one, and I want to say to those who are following it that it will be rescheduled. But at this point in time, we have decided to postpone it for today until another day in the near future.
Those remarks from earlier today. The Senate has now gabbled back in for debate this afternoon on an energy efficiency bill. Live now to the Senate floor.
Madam President.
The Senator from Colorado.
Madam President, are we on a quorum call?
No, we are not.
Madam President, thank you for the recognition. I rise today to talk about the unimaginable losses that all of us in Colorado have experienced over this last week. While much of the nation's attention was focused on Syria or here on the activities in Washington, those of us in Colorado watched rainfall for 1, 2, 3, 4 days straight with no end in sight. Creeks like the one that runs behind my home in El Dorado Springs swelled. Culverts like those near Commerce City quickly filled with rushing water. And rivers like the Big Thompson near the beautiful town of Estes Park turned into walls of water that threatened entire communities. From the foothills of the Rocky Mountains to the eastern plains, rivers overtopped their banks, crumbling highways, drowning family homes, and transforming entire farms into lakes. And, Madam President, many Americans have seen photos like this one that show the widespread and indiscriminate path of the floodwaters. And in some places, even today, entire communities are still underwater. Families and homes uprooted by the ferocious strength of nature. Madam President, it said water makes the West possible, but this past week Mother Nature gave us rain for 5 straight days, and now at least 8 people are dead and hundreds are still missing or in need of rescue. And we pray that we find every single one of those missing persons alive and in good health. As of today, the President has issued major disaster declarations for 4 counties, and 15 counties are in a state of emergency where life-saving rescue efforts are still underway. In these areas, active search and rescue operations are being conducted 24 hours a day by the Colorado National Guard, local police and fire departments, and rescue teams flown in from across the state and around our country. At least 19,000 homes have been damaged or destroyed. Several towns, such as Jamestown and Lyons, have been washed out and lack even the most basic public services. The town of Estes Park, which I mentioned earlier, which is the gateway community to Rocky Mountain National Park, has literally, Madam President, cut off from the rest of the state because the 2 major highways to it have literally been destroyed, and the only access road will soon be closed for the winter. Now, there are some wonderful, inspiring stories out of these events that we couldn't comprehend and we couldn't predict. I want to start with the National Guard. The National Guard has done amazing, outstanding work rescuing thousands of Coloradans who have been affected by this disaster. And they tell me that more people have been rescued by air during the past few days than any time since the devastation we saw with Hurricane Katrina. We've seen, Senator Bennett, who's here with me, the governor, many members of our congressional delegation, the devastation of these floods with our own eyes. Just a few days ago, Saturday to be exact, Senator Bennett and I joined others to fly over flooded areas in Boulder and Larimer counties with the Colorado National Guard unit. And at one point, Madam President, as we circled over an area, we spotted a couple of families waving for help, and we were able to land and be a part of the effort that brought them out of these isolated situations. That experience impressed upon me the very human side of this disaster. And as we all know, that behind these graphic images that are being shown on TV are the lives of thousands of Colorado families, some forever changed. While so much of this disaster has taken on the grand proportions of a historic disaster, those whose lives have been affected by this flood have endured it on a very personal scale. And I think this photograph says it all. It's been the family that has to dig through mud and debris just to get into their kitchen, or the older couple who returns from an evacuation to see their lifelong home completely destroyed, or even, as I mentioned earlier, the extended family members who sit by the phone waiting for a call from a missing aunt or a niece or a child or a friend. These are the very human faces of this tragedy. And it's a tragedy from which we can't recover alone. The outpouring of support from our friends and neighbors has been so crucial to early response efforts, and this generosity will only strengthen us as we begin to recover. After all, there's no I in Colorado, and it's this strong sense of community that will allow us to recover from this disaster and to rebuild stronger and more resolute than before. And we're also going to rely on the full support of our federal partners. I've long supported disaster aid during Hurricane Sandy and Katrina, as well as when we've experienced other countless acts of God. And it's time again for us to come together as one nation and rebuild. This will not be fast. It will not be easy. Many of our narrow mountain highways that have been carefully built through steep canyons have been destroyed, washed downstream. And these highways, like those in the presiding officer's state, are the economic basis for our mountainous state. For without them, trade and movement of any kind comes to a complete standstill. Madam President, I took this photo as we flew over what looks to be a river, but it actually used to be a stretch of U.S. Highway 34 outside of Estes Park. That major east-west highway is gone. I mean, I'm astonished again looking at the photograph and the feelings that I know Senator Bennett and I and many others had on Saturday. It was these were oh my God moments over and over and over again. Mother Nature has literally rewritten the map. And this isn't an isolated incident in this canyon. There are dozens of these washouts like you see here. And that's why I'm going to fight in this Congress for full federal support of the recovery and rebuilding effort. And I'm confident that support will be there, just as it was for so many others in their time of need. In the meantime, individuals and businesses that are still dislocated or figuring out the extent of the damage must take action. So I want to share some advice that I've received from FEMA and the other agencies involved. If your home was damaged because of the storms of the past week, please go to disasterassistance.gov in order to view federal assistance that may be available to you and to submit your claim. So that's right here, disasterassistance.gov. And I urge everybody to go there to enroll, if you will, on that website. If you operate a small business that's been affected by the flooding, you should register your claim with the Small Business Administration by going to disasterloan.sba.gov. So again, if you have a small business, you've been affected by the flooding, go to this website, disasterloan.sba.gov. And if you're just looking, as so many people are, for a way to help those who are suffering as a result of this tragedy, please go to helpcoloradonow.org, where the state of Colorado has pooled resources to assist those in need. Madam President, as I conclude, again, I want to reference that in so many ways the history of our part of the nation, the West, it's been a story of water. But now that very resource that's the lifeblood is writing a new chapter in our history as it runs uncontrolled over every road, field, and structure in its path. But we're Colorado tough. We're rugged cooperators, and our spirit of strength and independence that's seen us through the most trying of times, it will see us through these days of loss and hardship. Madam President, thank you for your attention. Thank you for your support. I yield the floor to my colleague and friend, and Michael Bennet.
Madam President.
The senator from Colorado.
Thank you, Madam President. I'd like to thank my colleague, Mark Udall, for summarizing so well what we're facing out in Colorado. I thought I'd share a few of my thoughts, too. As Senator Udall said, our state is in the midst of unprecedented flooding that has wiped out entire communities in over a dozen counties across Colorado. Last week, rain began to fall across our state, across the Colorado, our Front Range, and it didn't let up. A lot of reports have called this historic, but to get your head around the scale and scope of the damage, it's important to express what that means in hard numbers. In the course of 1 week, Madam President, 21 inches of rain fell in parts of Boulder, including over 9 inches on September 12th alone. The previous all-time high for a single day in Boulder was 4.8 inches in 1919, and they've kept records since 1893. The average annual precipitation in Denver is 14.9 inches for an entire year. On September 12th, 11.5 inches poured down on Aurora, just to give you a sense of the order of magnitude here. Almost as much rain as it typically gets in a year on one day. And it was the same story all across the Colorado Front Range. The result was flooding, destruction, and tragedy on an unprecedented and unmanageable scale. Based on the latest estimates, over 17,000 homes have been seriously damaged. Over 1,500 homes were completely destroyed. Over 2,300 agricultural properties were flooded. In just Larimer County alone, they estimate 200 businesses were destroyed and 500 more were damaged. At least 30 highway bridges are destroyed. At least 20 more are seriously damaged. Hundreds of miles of major roads have been washed away, as Senator Udall said. The floodwaters consume more than 2,000 square miles across 15 counties along the Front Range, an area about twice the size of Rhode Island. And because the rain is just finally letting up, and emergency officials are only beginning to measure the magnitude of this, these numbers could easily go up, and they could go up a lot. As recently as yesterday morning, 4 days after the flooding reached a crisis, over 1,000 Coloradans are still stranded, waiting for evacuation. Hundreds are still not accounted for. Tens of thousands were forced to evacuate. Many have had to abandon their home within minutes, grabbing whatever they could carry and wading through the rising waters to seek shelter and safety. And most tragic of all, Madam President, 8 Coloradans are either confirmed or presumed dead as a result of this storm. Those are just some of the numbers and a taste of the pain that this disaster has brought to cities and counties across our state. As Senator Udall said over the weekend, I joined him and Governor Hickenlooper and others on a helicopter tour of the damage. And from the air, the scope and scale of the destruction boggles the mind. And here's some of what we saw. These photos are taken from the Denver Post and other media. Here's an image showing dozens of vehicles flooded in Greeley, Colorado. Here's a home and a car stranded after a flash flood destroyed a bridge near Golden. Dozens of other bridges collapsed. Let's see what. This is a picture of the Big Thompson River washing out the Loveland Water Storage Reservoir. In this picture, young Casey Roy, 9 years old, is looking through a window into her family's basement under 3 feet of water. There are thousands of families in Colorado just like Casey's. And then finally, This image shows the Big Thompson River overflowing and tearing apart Colorado US 34 in the Big Thompson Canyon, another example of the damage to infrastructure across our state. Madam President, how much time is remaining?
No time is remaining.
I'd ask for an additional 5 minutes.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. I don't want to go on too much longer, but in addition to showing these images, I do want to pass along a few of the stories we're hearing from Colorado families from the past week. In Jamestown, a small mountain community of just a few hundred people in the mountains northwest of Boulder, a mudslide destroyed the home of 72-year-old Joey Hallett, a pillar of the community. It killed him. In the hours that followed, Jamestown residents pooled their resources so that no one was without food or shelter. The town, isolated from outside assistance, was split in two, literally split in two by the flood, so they rigged a pulley system to carry food, medicine, and supplies across the rising waters to fellow townspeople. Just outside of Lyons, Colorado, 4 adults, 3 children, and 2 dogs had to scramble up hills and across ledges with no trails to escape the floodwaters. At one point, they literally had to make a human chain across waist-deep water so that nobody would be carried away. So just a couple of the stories from Colorado. There are thousands of stories like these across our state. We know these floods are devastating. We know the loss that some Colorado families feel today is beyond words. We know that some have lost loved ones and many others have lost homes and businesses that took them decades to build. But stories like this remind me that Coloradans are resilient, that the worst disasters often bring out the best in our neighbors. And all across the state, we've seen Coloradans of different ages, different backgrounds, different beliefs pull together and help each other get through this massive storm. And we saw real heroism 1,000 times a day as first responders, our National Guard, risked life and limb to carry the young, the old, and the vulnerable, and the injured to safety. I want to close by saying thank you to the FEMA administrator for his prompt response to our request to declare a disaster. And he would not let me leave the floor without saying that if you are in Boulder, Weld, Adams, or Larimer counties and you are affected, you can go to disasterassistance.gov or call 1-800-621-FEMA to register for disaster assistance. As we move from rescue to recovery, frustration and enormous challenges lie ahead. We know that in the coming weeks, months, and even years, Colorado is going to face a lot of rebuilding. And we will rise to this occasion. We will build it back better than it was before it was destroyed. And we're going to fight every day for Colorado families, many of whom have lost everything, to make sure they're getting the support they need. And with that, I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the Senate will resume consideration of S. 1392, which the clerk will report.
Calendar number 154, S. 1392, a bill to promote energy savings in residential buildings and industry and for other purposes.
Madam President,
Senator from Illinois.
unless the senator from Oregon has something to say at the moment, I was going to ask for a few minutes of morning business. I ask unanimous consent to speak in morning business for 3 to 5 minutes.
Without objection.
Madam President, it is one thing for a politician to say he misspoke and another for most ordinary people to say they just got it wrong. I made a statement on the floor of the Senate earlier this morning which turns out was not entirely accurate, and I would like to clarify it and correct it for the record. I was recounting the history of the Social Security program created by Franklin Roosevelt in 1935 and recounted that it faced a filibuster in the United States Senate. I mistakenly believed that it was a Republican filibuster when in fact it was a filibuster by Senator Huey Long, a nominal Democrat, who was filibustering because of his support of certain agriculture subsidies. So I want the record to be clear that the filibuster to delay or in any way impact the implementation of Social Security was in fact by Senator Long, not a Republican filibuster. I also want to note that the information I used on the floor was derived from a book which I'm reading, entitled Citizens of London by Len Olson, and it is no reflection on her that I got that fact wrong. I just remembered it wrong when I spoke to it on the floor. The Washington Post is going to go to great length tomorrow to explain my other errors in my statement, and I acknowledge that I could have done more research before coming to the floor, but stand by the premise that the notion that we are somehow going to filibuster the Affordable Care Act to delay its implementation is not in the best interest of the United States. If this bill or law needs amendment or repair, let's do it on a bipartisan basis rather than just voting 41 times as they have in the House to abolish it. I also believe that it is valuable for this country to face the cost of health care. If we are going to deal with America's debt and deficit, we have to acknowledge that 60% of it relates to health care cost. The other side, the Republican side, has not come up with any alternative to deal with this health care crisis. We believe that the President's legislation, which I proudly supported, is a step in the right direction. It can be improved. I will work to improve it, but simply saying we are not going to allow it to be implemented is not a positive effort to improve the situation in America, and I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Oregon.
Madam President, as bipartisan discussions go on over the next hour or two on the important Shaheen-Portman energy efficiency legislation, I want to take just a few minutes to outline where we are, why this bill is so important, and how it's going to affect energy policy deliberations generally. And I appreciate colleagues on both sides. I see senators from both sides who I think would very much like to see Democrats and Republicans work out an agreement to move forward on the Shaheen-Portman legislation. When you look at this bill, it is almost the platonic ideal of how consensus legislation ought to work in the United States Senate. You have, in effect, a bipartisan Energy and Natural Resources Committee, and we are very pleased that the President of the Senate has joined the committee very recently. This bipartisan, committee taking a piece of bipartisan legislation authored by Senator Shaheen and Senator Portman, two of our most thoughtful senators. We took their bill to the floor of the Senate, and, Madam President, hour after hour after hour, the bill got more bipartisan. You had, starting with the distinguished senator from Oklahoma, Senator Inhofe and Senator Carper, come with a thoughtful amendment with respect to thermal energy, and the list just went on and on. Senatorial pair after senatorial pair came to the floor and said that they wanted to show that, lawmaking 101 is Democrats and Republicans working together in a bipartisan way, and they wanted to respond to what we heard Americans say all during the summer break. And no matter what part of the country you're from, the message was the same. Go back there, deal with the important issues for the economy, let us expand the winner's circle in a middle-class-driven economy. And that's what this legislation does. It's going to help create jobs. It's going to allow consumers to save money, which they save through practical energy savings. And it's going to increase American productivity. That's why it is an extraordinary coalition that's assembled for Senator Shaheen and Senator Portman's legislation. Business Roundtable, National Association of Manufacturers, with environmental groups, public interest organizations. Incredible breadth of support for this bill. And what I've been struck by in discussions over particularly the last 24 hours is this question of, okay, the Senate is now finally on energy legislation. We actually did a major bill, as the President of the Senate knows, right before the August recess, the hydropower bill. Hydropower is the biggest source of clean power in the country right now, 60,000 megawatts, essentially the potential production delivery out of that legislation. But this is the first bill to actually be on the floor of the Senate since 2007. So a number of senators have said we've got this huge pent-up demand to work on energy, and now we have scores and scores of amendments coming in on this bill, perhaps as many as 60 amendments that senators want to offer. Now, obviously, we could probably be here until New Year's Eve working on this legislation if you have scores and scores of amendments coming in. And what I've tried to tell senators is we can't do everything under the sun, literally and figuratively, with respect to this bill, and still be able to move on to other subjects. We would not be able to deal with the continuing resolution and a whole host of other issues that the Senate has to tackle. So there has to be some limits. So my hope, Madam President, is agreement can be reached out, be worked out on several of the issues that senators have felt most strongly about, and then Senators Reid and McConnell can work out an agreement to have a finite number of amendments that will address energy, issues, hopefully bipartisan, and we can then move to a vote on energy efficiency. And it seems to me there's no reason why theoretically that could not be done this week. If you had votes on a couple of these issues through a procedural agreement that would address what senators have been debating over the last few days, and then the leaders come up with a finite list of amendments on the other issues, we could finish this bill this week. I think it's important for the institution to do this. I would say to senators who want to debate a whole variety of energy issues that deal with, for example, the EPA, we can't do all of those issues on this bill. The Energy Committee doesn't really have jurisdiction over those issues. Those are going to come up. And some of what senators are most concerned about, the government hasn't even acted yet. In other words, it's one thing to have a response from the Senate after an agency has acted. On some of these matters, the agency hasn't even acted yet. So it ought to be possible, Madam President, to find a path forward that would allow for votes on the several issues that have been debated since the middle of last week. I think there is a way to do that if we can get an agreement on a finite list of additional amendments so that both sides could have some other questions aired and we could vote on energy efficiency. The reality is, Madam President, that on this question of energy efficiency, those who are most knowledgeable on the subject say that our country has plenty of room for improvement. As of 2011, our country ranked 9th out of the top 12 global economies in the amount of energy it uses to generate every dollar of goods and services it produces. This is what is commonly known, and we've looked at it in the committee, as energy productivity. Now, this is not a hypothetical exercise. As of 2008, industries consumed about 1/3 of the total U.S. energy use. The biggest users were chemicals and petroleum refining, pulp and paper, iron and steel, and obviously other important industries are energy intensive as well. Now, a lot of those employers know that using less energy means lower costs and higher margins. Especially larger companies are in a position to take the steps that will allow them to tap those financial gains. but the small and medium-sized companies often don't have the technical expertise to know about which upgrades are going to make the biggest difference. So here we have this bipartisan bill that comes along and without, Madam President, putting any mandates on the private sector, not a single mandate, not one on the private sector, this bill takes 3 steps that can help our small companies, and this is the kind of company that dominates the Oregon economy, and I know the Wisconsin economy has many small businesses as well. And with these 3 steps, these companies, these small companies, are going to be able, with this legislation, to be more competitive. First, the bill tells the Energy Department to reach out to the small businesses, the small and medium-sized businesses, and make their experts available so that these small businesses can learn directly what the commercially available energy-efficient technology is in their area that will allow them to become more competitive. Second, it creates rebate programs to encourage manufacturers to replace some of their inefficient equipment, particularly motors and transformers. These are 2 pieces of equipment in particular that have long service lines and often get rebuilt instead of replaced because of the high cost of replacement. Finally, the legislation establishes a program called Supply Star to recognize companies that have successfully made their supply chains more efficient. Once again, voluntary, modeled after the Energy Star program, and I would just offer up that in this debate about what the government's role is in an all-of-the-above energy policy, these kinds of approaches that have a market-driven orientation, that are voluntary in nature, these are ones that I think are going to allow our country in the days ahead to keep ahead of the competition. Now, in wrapping up, Madam President, we do have apparently over 60 amendments, filed, and a significant chunk of them aren't on the topic of energy efficiency. So I hope that as we try now, and I see the distinguished senator from Ohio on the floor, Senator Shaheen on the floor, others who have strong concerns and are going to look to see if we can put together a bipartisan approach here over the next few hours. I'd ask senators to focus on what is doable, which is to have votes on the several issues that have been debated over the last few days, and then come to a finite agreement on the rest of the issues that would be offered, hopefully by colleagues on both sides of the aisle, and then we could vote. Then we could vote, quaint that the idea might be, on an energy efficiency bill, which is the topic that has been before the Senate since the middle of last week. So, Madam President, I note the senator from Ohio is on the floor. He brought a good bill with Senator Shaheen to the floor in the middle of last week. It got better with the Inhofe-Carper amendment on thermal energy, the Landrieu-Wicker amendment, which helps us make better use of the green building certification system, Hoeven-Pryor amendment that allows the continued use of grid-enabled water heaters to make utility management programs more efficient, the Sessions-Pryor and the Landrieu-Wicker amendments that reduce regulatory, burdens on testing consumer products, the Bennett-Ayotte amendment on commercial buildings, the Pryor-Alexander amendment to look at how the review process works in terms of planning our energy future, the Isaacson-Bennett amendment to look at home efficiency during mortgage underwriting. Madam President, when you think about this, the reality is people seem to know more about the energy efficiency of the products you have around your house, like a toaster, than you do about a major, really an extraordinary purchase like a home. And so you have a bipartisan duo in the Senate, Senator Isaacson and Senator Bennett, who want to address it. And it was a terrific amendment, in my view. Then there's the Bennett-Coburn amendment, the Udall-Risch amendment, saving taxpayers money by saving energy in federal computer data centers. Senator Klobuchar and Senator Hoeven trying to make our nonprofits make better use of their energy, because with their tax status, it's hard to qualify for some of the opportunities to save energy. So I could go on with this, but it just highlights how a bipartisan, committee took a bipartisan bill from Senator Shaheen and Senator Portman, and then a big group of bipartisan senators made it better, and that's what we could pass, Madam President, and we could do it this week. And for all the senators who have said there is this pent-up demand since the Senate hasn't been dealing with energy since 2007, I'd say the only way we can really get to all those topics is to pass a bill like this that does have a finite list of amendments, and then lets us vote on Shaheen Portman. Several of my colleagues are on their feet. With that, Madam President, I would yield the floor. And I would also just make a unanimous consent request that Larkus Pickett, a fellow in our office, be given Senate floor privileges for the duration of consideration of S. 1392.
Without objection.
I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Ohio.
I appreciate the chairman of the Energy and Natural Resources Committee's comments regarding this energy bill and his suggestion of a way forward. We did have a good debate last week, not just on the underlying legislation, but also, as he indicated, on 7 different bipartisan amendments. I know we have a couple of colleagues who are interested in coming to the floor today to talk about additional amendments. I think we have an opportunity here to actually come together as Republicans and Democrats with a good bill, but improve it through some of these amendments that have been discussed on the floor. We do need a way forward here. We need to know that we're going to have the opportunity to have a good debate on these issues, to have votes on these issues. Specifically, I know Senator Vitter is going to speak in a minute about his amendment. I hope he will be given a vote on his amendment. My understanding is there is an interest in doing that, and perhaps allowing the other side to have their point of view expressed as well, along with his vote. And if we can have that move forward, my understanding is then we would be able to agree to a series of amendments, perhaps an equal number on each side. I'm looking at a list here of about a dozen amendments that are truly bipartisan. I'm looking at another list of maybe 20 amendments that are people on our side of the aisle are interested in offering, some of which are directly related to energy, some of which are not. I'm hopeful that we can come up with some time agreements that are reasonable and come up with a list that makes sense. The alternative is for us to turn our back on an opportunity here to be able to help grow our economy, to be able to reduce our imports of foreign energy, specifically oil. We'll miss an opportunity to be able to save taxpayers a bunch of money from forcing the federal government to be more energy efficient, to practice what they preach. And finally, an opportunity, I think, before us to have a cleaner environment, to have one of the important legs of all of the above energy strategy, not just debated on this floor, but actually passed by this Senate, that would then go to the House, where there's a lot of interest on both sides of the aisle in doing something comparable, and then go to the President's desk for signature, and actually be able to move the country forward on what I think is needed, which is a national energy plan that takes into account, again, producing more energy, as we talked about last week. I'm interested in ensuring that we use the resources we have here in the ground in America, but also using that energy more efficiently. It just makes too much sense for us to allow this opportunity to go by. And so I'm hopeful that even in the next few hours here, we can come together with a list of amendments that make sense. We can move forward by allowing the Senate to express its view on the Vitter Amendment and other amendments on both sides of the aisle that come forward, but also move this underlying legislation forward at a time when, frankly, we need a little bipartisanship around here. I mean, at a time when we seem to be gridlocked on so many big issues, maybe by finding a way forward on a relatively narrow issue of energy efficiency, and one where there's a lot of consensus, a lot of common ground, frankly, we can provide a model for dealing with some of the bigger issues. We do have some time this week to do this. However, the continuing resolution is likely to come over from the House soon. I hope it will, because we've got to be sure that we deal with that issue before the end of this month. So my urging of my colleagues is, if you haven't already come over to talk about your amendment, please do so today, understanding you may not be able to offer it in an official manner. You'll be able to talk about it, which will help expedite the process later as we get moving on these amendments, which I hope we'll do again even after coming up with this agreement today. And then if you have an amendment that you don't think is on this list, be sure and tell us right away. I do think getting this across the finish line should be something that Republicans and Democrats alike can agree to. I'm not suggesting everybody's going to vote for it, but I think everybody should be willing to let us have a chance to move this legislation. By the way, it's endorsed now by over 260 groups, including the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which decided to key vote the legislation late last week. As they looked at some of these amendments and looked at the underlying bill, they think it's important enough to key vote it. But it's not just the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. It's also the Alliance to Save Energy, which is a group that has worked on this legislation with us for almost 3 years now. It's also the National Association of Manufacturers. It's the environmental groups, including NRDC, which is an unusual combination when you have business groups and environmental groups saying, hey, this makes sense. It helps make our economy more competitive. It helps create jobs, gets us away from our dependency on foreign oil. It actually makes the environment cleaner, and that's a combination that you don't see often. So my hope is that we will move forward, and again, urge my colleagues to come forward to help us move forward by talking about your amendments today, so that when we have a chance to move forward officially on these amendments, we can do so expeditiously. I see that my colleague from New Hampshire is on the floor here, Senator Shaheen. I know that she's speaking with her side of the aisle. I'm talking to my side of the aisle, trying to, again, come up with a list of amendments that are agreed to and within a reasonable time frame. And I'm hopeful that we'll be able to move forward on that, again, just here in the next few hours. With that, I will yield back my time and look forward to talking about some of these amendments as people bring them to the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from New Mexico.
Madam President, I want to commend my colleagues, Senator Shaheen and Senator Portman, for their work to bring this legislation to the floor. And I want to commend as well Chairman Wyden and Ranking Member Murkowski for their leadership in the Energy Committee. Fully half of the energy that we use in this great country is wasted. And that is a fact that we can no longer afford to ignore. Each one of us is able to make changes in our daily lives to increase our energy efficiency. There is no kilowatt hour, no BTU, more valuable than the ones we don't actually use in the first place. But it's clear that we're going to have to do a lot more than turn the lights out when we leave home to be a leader in the world in this field. As the largest energy consumer in the United States, I think that the federal government has not only an obligation, but also an opportunity to lead by example when it comes to energy performance. We know that buildings are the largest energy consumers in the United States today. Accounting for over 40% of our use, they offer the greatest opportunities for energy savings. Over the summer, I had an opportunity and the privilege of joining the Department of Energy in presenting the Brackish Groundwater National Desalinization Research Facility. That's a mouthful, I know. But it's an important research facility in New Mexico, in my home state. And we presented them with the Better Buildings Award on behalf of the DOE. The Federal Energy Management Program designed those awards, the Better Buildings Awards, to encourage significant reductions in energy usage and in federal buildings all across the country. Reductions that go above and beyond the current codes and mandates that exist. Now, what the team at the Desalinization Research Facility accomplished, in my view, was nothing short of truly impressive. Just what is possible with legislation like this and in the field of energy efficiency. They were able to save approximately 300,000 kilowatt hours per year, an annual savings of $42,000. That's a remarkable 53.6% of their former energy footprint at a time when that research facility was actually increasing the amount of research going on. Now, they did this through thoughtful analysis by implementing both active and passive energy conservation techniques, and with a capital investment of literally less than $800. So for $800 and some engineering expertise, this research facility was able to save the taxpayers over $40,000 last year, $40,000 next year, $40,000 the year after that, and into the future. That is a window into why this kind of legislation is so important and why we ought to be able to find common ground when it comes to energy efficiency. Madam President, I'd also like to touch on another area of rapid energy innovation that's relevant to this legislation, the lighting sector. Lighting consumes 22% of the energy, of the electricity that's generated in this country. That's $50 billion per year for consumers across the United States. In Albuquerque, Sandia National Laboratories is accelerating advances in what's called solid-state lighting, or SSL, a rapidly evolving technology with the potential to reduce energy consumption in lighting by a factor of 3 to 6 times. You might have seen some of the new solid-state lights if you've been to Home Depot or Lowe's or your locally owned hardware store. These light bulbs are so efficient that when I was installing a couple in my son's bedroom a few weeks ago, you could literally put your hand on the light bulb because they make such good use of the energy that they use. Now, Sandia's worked in solid-state lighting for a long time, and their SSL Lighting Science Center is exploring new energy conversion techniques, tailored photonic structures, and drawing on their long history of research and development in this area, and frankly, working closely with both university and private sector partners. They're working to understand the mechanisms and the defects in SSL semiconductor materials so that they can make these already incredibly efficient light bulbs even more efficient. Sandia is investigating the basic conversion of electricity to light using radically new designs that can take these things even further. Things like luminescent nanowires and quantum dots and even hybrid architectures that may be the bright light bulb of the future. This progress, driven by basic research, by science, frankly, it's the kind of investments that historically have made our country great and made our economy so strong. And the Shaheen-Portman bill will spur the use of energy-efficient technologies like these, where all of us live and work, and in turn will lower utility bills for consumers and save money for taxpayers. Furthermore, this bipartisan bill will strengthen U.S. competitiveness by stimulating significant private sector research and development, investments in manufacturing innovation and productivity. Investing in energy efficiency is one of the fastest and also the most cost-effective ways that we can grow our economy. It's estimated that this measure alone, just this piece of legislation, would help create 136,000 new jobs by 2025. And by 2030, the bill would net an annual savings of over $13 billion, with a B, billion dollars for consumers, lowering CO2 emissions and other air pollutants by the equivalent of taking over 20 million cars off the road. Now, my home state of New Mexico is already capitalizing on a highly diversified but rapidly transforming energy sector and stands to benefit from leveraging investments in efficiency projects and innovative technologies. Through American ingenuity, we can slow the effects of climate change and unleash the full potential of cleaner, homegrown energy, creating a stable and healthier nation for future generations of Americans. So I would urge my colleagues, instead of transforming this debate into a debate about what is fundamentally supposed to be a debate about energy efficiency, into another tired battle over Obamacare, I would urge my colleagues to embrace the fact that this bill truly represents the culmination of years of bipartisan work to craft a smart, effective energy bill with a good chance of actually becoming law. Now, I know when I go home, and I've talked to many of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, one of the things that we hear the most right now is, why can't you guys just get something done? Why can't you work on something together? This is an opportunity to show that we can still legislate, that we can come together on the things that we agree on, even while agreeing to disagree on many other issues. Again, I want to thank Senator Shaheen and Senator Portman for working so tirelessly on this bill. I want to thank the chair and ranking member of the Energy Committee for making it a priority, and for all the senators in that committee who worked together on both sides of the aisle to see this move forward. I hope that as a Senate we will seize this opportunity, and I would yield back my time. Madam President.
Madam President.
The Republican whip.
Madam President, I wanted to come to the floor a day after a terrible tragedy befell Washington, D.C., and particularly those who live and work around the Washington Navy Yard. Hardly a mile from this building, in the shadow of its dome, there occurred an act of senseless violence that took the lives of 12 men and women and injured several more, as well as the life of the shooter himself. These men and women worked, by and large, in the service to our country, whether as uniformed military or as civilian contractors. And of course, they are more than just the numbers usually ascribed. They are mothers and fathers, brothers, sisters, husbands, and wives. When I heard about this shooting yesterday as I was traveling from Texas back to Washington, D.C., I couldn't help but think about a not too dissimilar tragedy that occurred about 4 years ago at Fort Hood, Texas, when Major Nidal Hasan killed 13 people there, as well as shot more than 30 others who were injured. At this difficult time, we of course pray for these souls that were unexpectedly taken from us. We pray for comfort for their grieving families and friends, and we pray that healing may come quickly for those who were wounded. We witnessed evil yesterday, but as so often is the case when the unthinkable occurs, accounts of tremendous bravery and self-sacrifice emerge. I found some small measure of solace in one such story that I read. It described how one gentleman at the scene, a man by the name of Omar Grant, guided his partially blind colleague to safety. As shots rang out and people ran for the exits, Mr. Grant took his colleague by the arm and, risking his own safety, made his mission to guide him out of the building. And this, of course, says nothing about the remarkable feats of bravery that the first responders who rushed to the scenes and who placed their lives at risk in order to preserve the safety of others ahead of their own. Yesterday's events remind us that life is fragile and that it is a precious gift. So let us express our deep gratitude for those who work around the clock, both at places like the Navy Yard and here at the Capitol, to those who help keep us safe. I want to thank the D.C. Metropolitan Police for their important role, the United States Capitol Police, and all the first responders for their extraordinary response. Their courage, their vigilance, and their sacrifices are what helps keep all of us safe, all of us who work here and visit our nation's capital. We thank them, and we promise, on behalf of a grateful nation, we will never forget. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Louisiana.
Mr. President, I was very happy to hear the description of a possible path forward from the majority handler of floor manager for this bill a few minutes ago, and I welcome that path forward. It's completely consistent with the UC I offered many, many times last week that was unfortunately then rejected, but hopefully it'll be accepted so we can have a productive path forward and have votes on these amendments, on so many amendments that were brought to this bill about energy, on my amendment, on other significant topics. Certainly sounds like the discussion at the majority lunch today was, let's just say, more appropriate and more productive than the discussion last Thursday. So I look forward to that path forward. As we hopefully build on that path forward, let me again explain why I think a clear up or down vote before October 1st on my amendment is really important and why I'm demanding it. It's not of my choosing that this be happening in terms of this illegal OPM rule. It's not of my choosing that that create this October 1st deadline, but that's exactly what's happened, which demanded that I act with my amendment language. And again, I'm joined by several colleagues, and I appreciate their partnership and their help. Mr. President, this all began in the Obamacare debate, in our debate and in our legislating on the Obamacare bill. In that process, an amendment was accepted. A Grassley amendment was accepted that said in clear and no uncertain terms that every member of Congress and that all congressional staff would go to the so-called exchanges, no ifs, ands, or buts. And the purpose of that language was crystal clear. The message was whatever the fallback plan for all Americans is, first it was the public option, then it became the exchange, whatever that fallback plan for all Americans is, that's what every member of Congress, that's what congressional staff should go to. No special deal, no special exemption, no special subsidy. That's what we should live by. And I certainly supported that language. It goes to what really is a fundamental rule of democracy. The governors should live by the same rules as the governed across the board. Our founders actually talked about that specifically. James Madison, co-author of the Federalist Papers, wrote Federalist number 57 specifically about this point. And a central theme in that Federalist number 57 was exactly this: what is good for America is good for Washington. The rule for America should certainly be the rule for those who have the particular honor and responsibility to help govern. And that should be the case across the board, certainly including in Obamacare. So that's why that provision got in the law, was passed into law, was signed into law by President Obama. Now, after that, I guess we sort of experienced what Nancy Pelosi described about Obamacare. Well, we had to pass the law to find out what's in it. Because after the law was passed, several folks around here in Capitol Hill in Washington read the law, read that particular provision, and they said, oh, you know what? They said, wait a minute, look at this. And they correctly noted that that clear language demands that all members of Congress, all congressional staff go to the exchange, and clearly our current subsidy for health care does not follow us there. In fact, there's a specific other section of Obamacare that says quite clearly that when an employee of a business goes to the exchange, that employee's employer contribution for an employer-based health care plan does not follow him or her to the exchange. So again, when a lot of folks around here, after the fact, read what was then the Obamacare law on that point, they really said, oh, you know what? That's when a lot of scurrying started, a lot of gnashing of teeth, a lot of scheming, a lot of discussion, and ultimately a lot of lobbying of the President and the Obama administration. Sadly, it was bipartisan, I believe. A lot of folks pushing to have the Obama administration simply issue a rule, a regulation that fixed all of this. Problem is pretty simple and pretty straightforward and pretty important. You're not supposed to be able to issue a rule or a regulation that's contrary to the statute. And that's what these folks were lobbying for, and sadly, that's what they got. Right as Congress was going into the August recess, safely leaving town, the Obama administration issued this OPM rule that my language is all about. And that rule is flat out, clearly illegal on two grounds. First of all, under this proposed OPM rule, every member of Congress gets to decide for himself or herself what staff members are even covered by the mandate to go to the exchange at all. Now that is just ridiculous and is directly contrary to the clear, unmistakable language in Obamacare. That language says all official staff go to the exchange. And now this illegal OPM rule is going to say, well, it didn't really mean all official staff. It just meant whatever any individual member of Congress decides. That's ridiculous and that's illegal. The second part of the OPM rule is just as illegal, just as ridiculous, just as objectionable. And it says whoever does go to the exchange, members of Congress and whatever staff do go to the exchange, they get to bring along with them their big taxpayer-funded subsidy from their previous federal employee health benefits plan. Well, wait a minute. Obamacare doesn't say that. In fact, there is a separate provision of Obamacare that says the opposite, that says when an employee goes to the exchange from a business, that employee loses his or her employer contribution. Specific part of Obamacare directly contrary to what this illegal OPM rule is trying to do. And so, again, the attempt is simply to rewrite the law by administrative fiat, yet again, to create another exemption from Obamacare, if you will, that is nowhere in the statute. That's wrong, that's illegal, and that demands action. That's why I, with several other members, House and Senate, came up with this language that I am proposing on the floor now as an amendment would stop this illegal OPM rule. It would say exactly what Obamacare says now.